for that and for having me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Cina Vazir. I'm here along with my colleague Abdurrehman Naveed, and we're here to really have a conversation today about the role that copper can play as an engine for economic development in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with a particular focus on midstream and downstream opportunities within the copper value chain. So let's get into it. Our presentation today is based off of research that we did, Abdurrehman and I did, that was supported by the Harvard Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the World Bank, but was really an independent piece of research. And what that research did is it essentially set out to evaluate midstream and downstream opportunities in the Democratic Republic of Congo within 5 mineral value chains. Those value chains were cobalt, copper, which we'll be talking about today, lithium, tin, and zinc, and to really analyze where the opportunities were within the country in the midstream and downstream stages of those value chains, and how attractive those opportunities were at a national level. So to zoom out for a second, we really approached our research and approached a lot of our work from a high level perspective. And given that this conversation will be focusing on copper, it's worth zooming out and discussing how copper is located as a piece within a much larger puzzle of national economic strategy and national economic development. So that'll be really the essence of our conversation together today. And in terms of what specifically we'll be talking about today, we want to kick off with a discussion about value addition, which is really this process of moving midstream and downstream within the copper value chain. We then want to do a quick overview of the copper market within the DRC and also at a macro level. Then getting more DRC specific, we want to dive into constraints. We'll then be looking, after we talk about the constraints, at midstream and downstream opportunities within the copper value chain in the DRC, and then concluding with recommendations. And as Hans said, we'll have space for a Q&A as well, where we look forward to hearing from you all and opening up space for a discussion. So Abdurrehman, if you want to get us started here on value addition.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Hans and the Copper God Academy for the opportunity. So value addition is not something new. It's been a part of the parlance of economic growth, development, for many, many decades now. And essentially, at a very high level, it's about countries, producers moving from upstream through the midstream to downstream. It has prevalence across continents, right? And so every single country that you can classify as developing has some sort of a vision or strategy for where it wants to go. So just as an example, within Africa, you have multiple countries like Botswana, the DRC, Ghana, Namibia. In South America, you have Chile, Argentina, Bolivia. The main takeaway here is all countries, all developing countries that are resource endowed naturally have some sort of a vision and strategy for value addition, but not all countries are equally successful. So for instance, Indonesia, with its nickel endowment and supplying 48% of global supply, has recently been more successful in developing its downstream industry, much thanks to Chinese foreign direct investment, right? And then you can contrast this with a country like Bolivia, which, even though it has the largest lithium reserves, has little to no production. So value addition, in the way it's envisioned and in the way it's implemented, spans the gamut from countries that have very cleared out strategies and implementation plan, and others which have a more nebulous understanding and implementation. Next. This is something that we have all heard and we're all familiar with, but in addition to all the secular trends that are driving demand, such as population growth in certain parts of the world, urbanization, one key factor that you cannot ignore in the conversation about the demand side for minerals is the energy transition. Now, you're all familiar with this graph. I think the key takeaway here is that there is a level of uncertainty in how demand is going to pan out. And so every single scenario from every single analyst that we have had the opportunity to produce has a fair degree of variance in where demand will end up and when, right? So I think that's the important takeaway here, that there is a level of uncertainty in the way the future demand will pan out. But what we know for sure is that directionally, it will be higher and it may be a step change. Next.
We're having a couple. Okay, there we go.
Again, this is something that's often talked about, but the clean energy transition across its different segments will be very mineral intensive, right? So, for instance, you have the mineral intensity of something like offshore wind that is 8x the time of the mineral requirement of natural gas per on a megawatt basis. Similarly, EVs are all the rage these days, but you see that they're almost 2.5 to 3 times as mineral intense as a normal conventional internal combustion engine vehicle. So this just goes on to show that where this demand is coming from within the overall umbrella of the clean energy transition. Next. So given that there will be such a demand side pull on all these minerals, there is of course money on the table, and this money or this value will run the gamut from upstream production to midstream operations to downstream end use cases, right? But let's just take copper for a moment, where it's expected between now and 2040, right? It has a $112 billion in revenues, and on the right we see how the evolution of the demand use cases for copper are changing. Where now we are currently 24-25% of copper use is driven by what you can classify as clean energy technologies, whereas in the more aggressive of estimates, this will almost double to 45%.
So we started out talking about value addition and the fact that countries are interested in moving midstream and downstream, and then spoke about the energy transition for a reason. And that reason is that as we look at different clean energy technology supply chains, a significant amount of revenue opportunities is projected to occur in the midstream and downstream phases, and even the recycling phases of those supply chains. So looking here at McKinsey projections for the lithium ion battery value chain, which is estimated to reach $400 billion of annual market opportunity by 2030, only 9% of that market opportunity is forecast to actually occur in the upstream phase of mining for battery materials, and the rest, the remaining 91% of revenue opportunities, are projected to occur in midstream and downstream, which is why so many different developing countries are interested in not just doing the mining, but also entering refining, processing, and manufacturing of downstream products. In addition to the revenue opportunities, which are shown here, it's worth saying, this is a very similar story for solar. It's a very similar story for wind, and it's not just about revenue, right? It's also about, for example, technological developments, R&D advantages. It's about workforce impacts and job creation. So there's an array of different benefits that countries stand to gain if they are to enter midstream and downstream phases of clean energy technology supply chains. The ability to enter those supply chains, so there's clearly a desire, but the ability to enter those supply chains is also buttressed by the current geopolitical environment. So as many of you know, the market share of the 3 largest upstream producers for minerals is actually far more concentrated than it is, for example, for fossil fuels like oil and natural gas. And that's particularly jarring given that oil and natural gas have been seen as some of the most geopolitical industries in the world, right? So minerals actually, from an upstream perspective, are even more concentrated, implying even more leverage for producers, which means that producing countries in the upstream have a strong hand to play in terms of attracting foreign direct investment and using their current position to essentially attract interest from a range of Western economies, Asian economies, China in particular. And then in the midstream phase of value chains, you see a huge amount of concentration in China, both in terms of clean energy technology manufacturing, but also in terms of a lot of the refining of minerals that gets done. And there's a huge effort right now going on within the West to try to diversify that midstream stage of supply chains, and also try to diversify that downstream stage of supply chains. So that interest translates well to mineral-rich countries, which are saying, hey, we can actually, we have a strategic priority to enter the midstream and downstream phase of supply chains. And we know that the West and a range of different countries are interested in that diversification, and therefore are increasingly interested in helping raise capital and support those diversification efforts. So more leverage, I think, is the headline for mineral-rich developing countries at this moment in time. Abdurrehman, back to you.
And to build on what Cina just said, value addition is not happening in a geopolitical vacuum. I think as it positions countries to leverage, given their national resource endowment, it also opens them up to a fair bit of legwork on their end that they have to do to navigate this space. Just as one example, the U.S. Last year passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which had significant quantum of demand and supply side subsidies. So for instance, one of the demand side subsidy, the Section 30D, which provides a 7,500 tax credit for sourcing both critical minerals and battery components from certain jurisdictions, critical minerals from free trade country, and battery components from North American supply sources, right? These are reconfiguring the contours of these value chains. So while there is leverage, a lot of the countries will also need to be able to navigate this. So for instance, Indonesia right now is trying to navigate this and trying to get an FTA with the US so that it can access this market. Some of the Chinese players are trying to reallocate capital to South Korea because South Korea has an FTA with the US and so might be eligible for those incentives, right? So where does that leave countries like the DRC, which are naturally endowed, but may not have the clout in the international arena to forge these relationships? I think that's a good food for thought, and that's definitely a story that's yet to be written. But coupling the geopolitics with the technology risk, so a lot of the clean energy technologies are by no means a foregone conclusion, and there is a fair bit of uncertainty across the different segments, whether that's the EVs, whether that's their batteries, of what the technological product mix would be. Just to give you a very high-level example, right? The current dominant chemistries in EVs are NMC, NCA, and then LFP, right? And recently, we have seen a greater shift from NMC and NCA to LFP. Now, what do these changes imply for countries such as the DRC, which are market movers and market makers of things like cobalt, right? Previously, we've seen that LFP was something that would only be dominant in China, but that's not the case. It's becoming very prevalent in the US and Europe as well. And so there are these considerations, right? The end use cases are not fixed, and that opens value addition to a lot of technology risk where there is uncertain demand and these mid and downstream activities have long lead times. Next. So in this overarching context, we are considering the role of copper in the DRC as an engine for economic growth. Traditionally, countries have viewed value addition as a tool to maximize fiscal revenues, drive their GDP, and bolster their export earnings. Some countries have also seen moving downstream as a way to reduce or dampen exposure to commodity volatility. And then the more recent trend has been of seeing going downstream as leading to better quality, higher paying jobs. And so in this sort of broad context, the question is, can value addition be a part of the solution, especially for developing countries like the DRC? Next. So what we try to do in our research, one of the elements amongst others is taking all these revenue, export, labor, workforce consideration to play, but also adding a capabilities element. And the capabilities framework, broadly defined, is essentially, yes, all those things are essential and important, but by themselves are not sufficient to get developing countries to where they want to be going. And we have seen multiple countries across the decades try value addition and not get the necessary results. So this capabilities framework essentially is saying that growth is driven by diversifying know-how into producing more complex goods and services, right? So if your country produces more complex goods and services, it's been empirically borne out in the economic literature that growth follows. The question is, how do you move or diversify into producing those complex goods and services, right? Sometimes you have adjacent industries or capabilities that you can repurpose to move into adjacent industries, while at other times there aren't any complementary capabilities that you can deploy to move into those industries. So for one instance, if you've been a conventional driller of oil and gas, one can make the case that it's it's somewhat logical that your skill set will translate well into sort of geothermal, given your experience with handling subsurface fluids, right? So some capabilities will give you leverage into moving into other industries, and fundamentally our argument is that countries should not value add indiscriminately, but very intentionally and deliberately with a view to diversifying away into those segments which have adjacent capabilities, one. And second, moving into those blocks of opportunities opens up further opportunities. So you don't want to move into an adjacent industry, which is a dead end industry. So taken together, that's a very high level view of the capabilities framework. Next.
Great, thank you, Abdurrehman. So now we'll get into a bit of an overview of copper, and then both in the DRC and briefly at a macro level. So the DRC has historically been a pretty important global producer of copper. So you see in the 1950s, the DRC was supplying around 8% of global mined copper. That number, was similar before the 1950s and was relatively stable at 6% up until the 1980s. Where a period of domestic turmoil really caused production in the DRC to plummet down all the way to 29,000 tons annually in 2002, before then beginning to rebound with new investment coming to the country at the turn of the century, and now actually is at 2 million tons, around 2 million tons of annual mine production, which is about 10% of the global mine market. So DRC has historically been an important player within copper, and now is really in a period of resurgence, reaching peak levels. And the country's GDP per capita has actually been pretty heavily linked historically to its copper output. So you see, from the 60s to mid 70s, DRC GDP per capita on a USD constant basis, growing somewhat stably at a relatively low rate, before then beginning to plummet, as I mentioned, with all the turmoil, but also with a much lower copper output at a national level during the 80s and 90s, and then beginning that gradual recovery in the 2000s. But essentially, there's a pretty strong line you can draw between the DRC's copper output and its national GDP per capita. And copper currently remains really extremely strategic for the country. So 61% of the country's current total exports by value come from copper, which is obviously a very large percentage, more than half. And copper is really forecast to continue being a driver of growth within the near and medium term in the DRC, just given the existing project pipeline and also the untapped potential with grades really well above global average. And importantly, copper is also a gateway to the DRC's cobalt, which is the other 31% of total exports. So together, copper and cobalt constitute 92% of the DRC's total exports. That 31% of cobalt really relies on copper because the DRC's cobalt is primarily produced as a byproduct of copper. Actually, globally, there are only 2 cobalt mines in the world that produce cobalt as a principal product. The rest produce cobalt primarily as a byproduct of copper in the DRC and as a byproduct of nickel in Indonesia. So essentially, the fortunes of the copper industry in the DRC are actually a huge driver of the fortunes of the cobalt industry, not only in the DRC, but also globally. So most, just to give you a view, the DRC is located right in the middle of Africa. It's a very large country. And the majority of copper production in the DRC is concentrated in the southern region of the DRC, close to the southern border with Zambia in what is commonly referenced as the ex-Katanga region, which has a long mining history within the country. And zooming out for a second, talking about copper at a macro level, right? So we've just discussed how copper is extremely strategic for the DRC at a country level, but the macro dynamics are actually making it even more strategic. So as we discussed earlier, you see huge amounts of growth coming in terms of copper demand from the energy transition. That growth is really just layered onto kind of organic growth that's coming in from trends such as urbanization, electrification, population growth, and economic growth. So you have organic natural demand growth, and then that being supported by really explosive energy transition growth to offer some very strong tailwinds to copper demand. But on the supply side globally, you have a series of headwinds that are essentially leading to projected relatively large supply gaps at a global level. Those headwinds include political, social, and regulatory instability in producing countries like Chile and Peru, who are major producers, really growing ESG risks for the industry, mining industry as a whole, declining ore grades for copper specifically, and higher interest rates globally. And these are all combining to create headwinds for the mining industry relative to copper, and creating essentially hurdles to meet the explosive growth in demand. What that means is for the countries that are able to bring copper to market, they're going to become extremely strategic within the global view, and copper for them is going to become more and more strategic as a way to bring in investment, and also as a way to attract international attention in other arenas and for other projects as well. So Abdurrehman, if you want to take us now through the constraints, specifically relative to the DRC.
Yes. So no developing country can claim to be free from structural constraints and challenges, but the DRC has its fair share of them. Key on the list in terms of value addition has to be energy. Even though the country has immense hydro potential, the capital expenditures haven't gone into those generation and transmission assets, and so the country struggles with meeting its peak demand. And as you can see, given the civil strife in the country in the 90s and 2000s, a lot of installed capacity has degraded to the extent that even there's a fair bit of delta between what's installed and what's available. So how that impacts production is you have very expensive energy, which is intermittent, which then affects manufacturing processes, disturbs production yields, increases scrap. And just to sort of hit this home, only 19% of the population has access to electricity. And like I said, 11%, there's 11% average annual loss of sales in the manufacturing sector due to power intermittency. And in most of the businesses we talked to while we were in the DRC on the ground doing our field work, we heard one resounding factor, and that was energy, the lack of it at affordable prices. If you could move to the next slide. Deeply intertwined with energy are logistics. So like Cina said, DRC is a large country, and it's also a country that is fairly diverse in terms of its geography. And so it's not very navigable given its natural resources and the way they're structured. And so the capital Kinshasa has, for all practical purposes, no road links to Lubumbashi, which is in the ex-Kandaga region and as in the copper cobalt belt, right? So I think that's emblematic on a very high level of the sort of challenges the country faces in integrating different parts of the country. But just as quick insight, all of the metrics for the DRC are substantially worse than its peers in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, the OECD countries. So, for instance, time to export is 3 times as much as its sub-Saharan peers. Cost to export is almost 4 times the amount of its sub-Saharan peers, and the list continues. I think the larger point here is that given the nature of the topography, coupled with civil strife and unrest over decades, has led to an infrastructure that is not fit for purpose in meeting a lot of the needs for the industry when it comes to value addition. Next. I think compounding energy and logistics is, of course, governance, where the DRC on most metrics of enabling environment does not fare that well. So in terms of government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, corruption, political stability, most independent estimates rank the country fairly low. And what this has done is this has deterred most of foreign investment into the country. So it takes a certain type of investor to go into the country and operate within that environment. And so a lot of FDI has not been forthcoming. Next. Linked to the previous part, given the country and sovereign risk in the country, the DRC generally commands a very high risk premium as compared to not only developed countries, but also, as we mentioned before, its regional peers. So these are figures from 2021. Of course, given the current interest rate environment globally, these have gone up significantly between now and then. But I think this hits home the point that doing capital intensive projects that have long lead times, the project viability of that can be significantly degraded by access to affordable by the lack of access to affordable capital. Next.
And then speaking about workforce as well as another additional constraint, obviously to move midstream and downstream, a country needs embedded capabilities within its economy and workforce preparation. But you see within the DRC here, what we have is a table of economic complexity, essentially a measure of how complex a country's exports are. And the DRC, out of 133 countries, is ranked 122nd. So one of the lowest countries in terms of its export complexity. And what that's a proxy for is the capabilities within the economy. So the fact that the economy is not currently exporting many complex products and hasn't been exporting many complex products for quite a long time indicates that within the economy itself, there are currently really a lack of workforce capabilities and workforce preparation to right away go and begin producing and exporting very complex products, particularly in relation to other countries that have a workforce that has a lot more experience doing that kind of thing and developing that kind of know-how. This is really hit home when you look at the DRC's manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing sector in the country currently accounts for 20% of the country's GDP, which on the surface seems like a decent figure. But when you dig deeper, you realize that the manufacturing is really currently failing to support or drive national economic growth. 85% of domestic manufacturing is in the food and drink sector. That is a sector that's typically insulated from international competition and is really necessary for survival. There needs to be a domestic food and drink sector in any country. So the fact that 85% of manufacturing takes place there indicates that manufacturing is really coalescing in the places where it's absolutely needed and is protected from international competition. But when you look at international competitive manufacturing, there's only 3% of the current 3% of the country's exports are actually manufactured products, which is an extremely low number and shows that there are very few things that the DRC can currently manufacture at internationally competitive rates. And as a result, manufacturing is having a very minimal role in helping the country develop economically. So getting into opportunities then, what are the opportunities specifically in the copper, midstream, and downstream for the DRC, given the range of constraints that we just outlined and the macro dynamics we alluded to earlier? The first large opportunity is for the DRC to continue to expand its copper refining capacity. Currently, the DRC refines approximately 77% of the copper that it mines domestically. And that's actually a decent figure. The US has a similar number, and the DRC refines a larger share of its copper that it mines and domestically than Chile, for example, or Peru. So 77% so far is not a bad number, but as the DRC continues to expand its output of copper, it'll also need to expand its refining capacity to maintain that 77% share, and will need to really grow its refining capacity at a much higher clip if it actually wants to come closer to reaching 100% of mine production if not actually refining more copper than it actually mines, which could take place by refining copper from regional countries as well and becoming a regional refining hub. So why does copper seem to be the most feasible mineral for midstream expansion? Really, there are three reasons. The first is that upstream production of copper is already stable. So copper and cobalt are the two minerals where upstream extraction currently in the DRC is stable and relatively mature. With tin, you have upstream extraction just developing, particularly in the east of the country. And then with zinc and lithium, you really have the upstream sector in a very nascent stage. So not necessarily ready right now to even think about refining. And for the workforce as well, you see a pretty similar story where copper, there's already refining going on in the country. The workforce has the capabilities. For cobalt and tin, you currently only have intermediary products. There could be a jump in capabilities, although possible. And for lithium, for example, you see much more difficulty in developing those midstream capabilities just due to how complex that is. So essentially for copper, a lot of those capabilities are already there. You can quite easily scale from a workforce perspective. And then lastly, in terms of energy intensity as well, we spoke about energy as a constraint for the DRC. But we see if you are a copper producer, making that marginal jump to refining can at times be a smaller jump than for something like lithium or something like cobalt, where the processing actually requires much more energy than the mining. But for copper, that's not always the case, and that gap is a lot smaller, meaning that the kind of marginal energy infrastructure that needs to be built for an existing producer to then enter into refining is a smaller jump. So what would copper refining bring at the national level? And what would be some of the benefits? We kind of outlined these categories earlier, but now weighing copper refining against them, we see that fiscal revenue and export earnings, the benefit level would be important, not game changing, but important. Smelting and refining copper is generally not as lucrative as mining and concentration is, but it still offers an important source of revenue at a national level. There is going to be less exposure to commodity price volatility because oftentimes we see that the refineries and smelters are a way to actually hedge against revenue and profit volatility, kind of in the upstream stage for miners. But then we see lower benefits for job creation and capability acquisition. Obviously, the mining industry is not one of the most labor-intensive industries. It doesn't necessarily have that reputation, and we see refining, even less so than mining. And for capability acquisition, this is something the DRC is already doing, and doing smelting and refining for copper doesn't necessarily link up with that many other economic activities that you can then move into. So relatively low benefits in terms of capabilities. There are some additional benefits that the DRC could get as well from increasing its refining share. One of those is lower transit costs. So industry itself can actually benefit substantially from exporting and shipping cathode rather than concentrate. And additionally, if one goes the pyrometallurgical route, byproducts such as sulfuric acid demand a very high premium at a local level, and anyone that is able to do more refining locally has the ability to sell some of those secondary products.
The second opportunity is taking copper cathode and turning that into first use applications such as rod and shapes, various shapes, semi such as wire strips, tubes, bars, and then final production, what you can classify or what we have classified as cable, things like cables, connectors, generators, motors, tubings for air conditioning, and so on. Currently, very little of this happens in the DRC, but based on our research, we believe that there is a market for this. And so if you see what the market opportunity is like, right next door in South Africa imports, as of 2020, for which the recent trade data is available, it imported $204 million worth of copper rods and wires. Similarly, Africa itself is a fairly material market, with countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt having significant import. So altogether, this can sum up to $1 billion of market that's potentially accessible. Now, will the DRC take all of this? Likely not. Can it take some of this? That's definitely a possibility that we see. So just to give you an illustrative example, currently 60% of the $204 million of copper rod and wire that we talked about, South Africa's imports, is currently satisfied by or supplied by Russia. Now, given the geographical distance, one would imagine that a country like the DRC is more capable and conducive to supplying markets in its backyard than Russia. And this similarly pans out that a lot of the existing routes on which copper cathode is transferred to be shipped to neighboring countries for onward processing, or to be shipped to the continental ports to be shipped globally, are actually on the same routes that those market exist. And so from that perspective as well, we feel that given that there are significant trade agreements, given that there are existing routes, these markets may be more accessible than hitherto perceived. Next. We've talked about challenges and how DRC experiences a fair share of them. But despite those challenges, we feel that this opportunity can be utilized and leveraged while staying cognizant of those challenges. So, for instance, energy, right? The energy used in something like wire manufacturing is less than that used in the processing of copper cathode by a factor of 10, right? So the energy used for something like wire production is incrementally is very incremental and marginal to what's already being used. So it's not that big of a constraint on the grid. Secondly, we talked about logistics and how producing and exporting copper products does not require the development of new roads, infrastructure, or logistical capabilities. So you can repurpose your existing routes, use those same routes, use those same vendors, use those same shippers to move these goods along. And then in terms of know-how, this is definitely something that in terms of capabilities, the DRC does not have, but it's also starting to build and put together. So during our time, we came across these two nascent, one of them more recent than the other, but Congo cables and protons. Congo cables in Lubumbashi and Proton in Kinshasa, and Proton being the more seasoned of the two. But essentially, these two operations are making copper wires, copper rods, and other copper finished products in the DRC. Fairly early stage, but we got the sense that there is a critical mass of know-how that can be scaled exponentially. Next. I think we can, in the interest of time, we can go to the next slide, Cina. Yes. So again, bringing our framework, while fiscal revenues and export earnings might only be incrementally higher, and we have details for all these numbers in our paper, which we can link and Hans can circulate. But as a top line analysis, even though fiscal earnings and export revenue will only be incrementally higher, and the exposure to volatility will also be there, we feel that from a capability acquisition standpoint, moving into the production of copper semis and finished products offers a country like DRC, which is naturally endowed and has a competitive advantage, more pathways to enter manufacturing and developing capabilities then can then serve as proof of concepts into going into adjacent areas.
So concluding with some recommendations for government and industry, beginning with smelting and refining and that copper midstream opportunity, our recommendations for the DRC government was really first to focus on public-private energy partnerships, because the government has a lot of difficulty providing sufficient energy, particularly for energy-intensive operations like refining. But there are significant energy opportunities within the country. So creating and standardizing public-private partnerships for a way for private entities to come in and build that infrastructure is extremely important. The second is focusing on carrots rather than sticks, and trying to alleviate constraints rather than trying to mandate industry does certain things. For industry, we think And in the refining stage, it's important to focus on various factors that are pull factors for midstream investment in DRC. That includes the factors we outlined, such as the copper growth potential within the country, particularly in the upstream stage. That's going to require midstream refining later on, the local demand for midstream capacity, and geopolitics as a way to essentially bring in more foreign investment and increase kind of external affairs standing. And then also to consider partnerships with clean energy companies as a way of developing the energy infrastructure. In terms of manufacturing, for the government, our recommendations were really three. The first is to engage with industry to focus on fixes for low-hanging fruits, such as tax policy. The second is to consider tax holidays with sunset provisions. And the third is to focus on partners kind of in an agnostic sense geopolitically, but really focus on bringing in partners that have a commitment to developing local manufacturing capacity and have the existing capabilities to be able to do copper manufacturing. And then for industry, we think it would be extremely important to develop partnerships to tap into Ex-Katanga region's potential. So those kind of partnerships could include, for example, integration with upstream producers and midstream producers to get copper kind of at a lower price, with taking advantage of, for example, transport arbitrage, which we've seen can be a large part of the copper costs in DRC, and also taking advantage of the formation of new special economic zones that have a lot of regulatory and tax advantages and are currently being formed within the Ex-Katanga region. So the copper manufacturers would definitely take advantage of that. And the second is to initially plan for potentially higher OpEx. This is something that would be new to the country. There are going to be some unexpected costs, like perhaps importing more skilled labor, paying for private quality inspections, and the like. So just having that kind of embedded within planning, that initial OpEx costs may be a little bit higher, but those are going to drop with time as the country and as that particular sector grows more mature. So that's it for the presentation, and now we would be happy to take questions and have a discussion about anything that we touched on over the course of the presentation. So back to you, Hans.